Throughout history, many great figures have left a profound impact on human civilization. From brilliant leaders and exceptional scientists to visionary thinkers, they have helped shape the world as we know it today. The man known to history as Howard Hughes was born at his family's home in Houston, Texas. The accepted date for his birth as recorded on his birth certificate was 24th of December 1905, although his certificate of baptism states that his date of birth was the 24th of September 1905, but recorded no place of birth. His father, Howard Robert Hughes Sr., was an entrepreneur who made a fortune during the Texas oil boom. His mother, Arlene Garno, daughter of a distinguished Dallas judge, became a full-time homemaker and mother after her marriage to Hughes. Arlene and Howard's courtship was rather short, only a few months in fact. Despite his fairly modest means at the time of his marriage, Arlene's family quite approved of Howard, who was handsome, charming, decently well-educated, and undeniably ambitious. Though he had dropped out of Harvard after his first year and later dropped out of law school, he had nonetheless managed to pass the bar exams and became a qualified lawyer without having completed his education. A restless sort, Hughes soon discovered that, as a profession, the law did not suit him. His most passionate interest had always been mechanical things and new inventions. He enjoyed taking things apart and putting them back together just to see how they worked. Yet, above all, Howard was determined to be a rich man. After giving up the law, he traveled throughout the United States, involving himself in several mining and oil ventures, all with highly variable results. He might make $50,000 in one venture, but then find himself $50,000 in debt following the next. The Texas oil boom, which began in 1901, attracted hundreds of hungry oil prospectors whose fortunes would change overnight, of whom Hughes was just one. Howard eventually partnered with fellow oil prospector Walter Sharp, with whom he built an extraordinarily successful company, the Sharp-Hughes Tool Company. Hughes discovered the flagship product that would eventually make millions for his company by way of a seemingly random stroke of good luck. One night, in the middle of a business trip, Howard stopped in at a bar for a quick drink by himself. Entirely by chance, he met and struck up a conversation with an oil driller named Granville Humason, who had designed and carved out of wooden spools a prototype of a new kind of drill bit. The fishtail bit, which was one of the most commonly used, took hours to get through rock. His design, Humason explained, featured a dual cone-shaped bit with 3 interlocking heads, each of which would spin continuously, ensuring that the drill would bore much more quickly and efficiently through rocky deposits. He had tried to sell his idea to a few wealthy oil drillers, but no one, as of yet, had shown interest or confidence in his invention. Hughes was wise enough about mechanics and experienced enough in oil drilling to see the opportunity in an instant, and he promptly offered Humason $150 for his idea and the wooden prototypes. Humason happily agreed. Hughes promptly borrowed $1,500 from his partner, Sharp, hired a lawyer who specialized in patent law, and soon secured a patent to the drill bit, but in his name alone. Eventually, he would hold the patent not only in the US, but in 13 other countries as well. When it was tested, the efficiency of the new drill bit astounded the workers on site, who dubbed the new drill bit the Rock Eater. The Hughes drill bit would eventually be used by countless oil drilling operations worldwide throughout the 20th century. By the time his son was ready to start school, Howard Hughes Sr. had laid the groundwork that would eventually make his only child the richest and one of the most powerful men in America. Howard's mother, Arlene, was much more reserved than her husband. They made an attractive and well-suited couple, but where he was outgoing, charming, and a strong personality, she was soft-spoken and shy in company. Howard had close and caring relationships with both of his parents during childhood, but he was particularly attached to his mother, with whom he spent the most time. Though the details are unclear, Arlene reportedly had a difficult pregnancy and labor experience with her son, and subsequently, a doctor advised her not to attempt having any more children for the sake of her health. As her only child, Arlene utterly devoted herself to Howard's care and nurture. Howard Sr. traveled a great deal for business during the first 5 years of his son's life, but Arlene always remained with Howard Jr. She never hired a nurse or a nanny for him, despite the fact that she and her husband could certainly afford it, but took personal charge of his daily care and early education. Arlene saw to Howard's meals, his clothes, and his daily bath herself. She played with him, taught him to read, and took him everywhere with her, whether on daily walks, household errands, or family visits. Arlene was often anxious, particularly about health and cleanliness, a pronounced preoccupation she passed on to her young son. She watched him constantly for any sign of illness. A rash, digestive distress, or a slight fever could cause her significant alarm. Whenever there was an outbreak of disease of any sort in the Houston area, Arlene was quick to take her son out of town until the trouble passed. She gave him doses of mineral oil daily and agonized over any perceived changes in his health, physical or mental. Contamination, Howard's biographers have noted, was a cause of major concern and worry in his childhood home, one which would mushroom throughout the course of Howard's life into an immense and sometimes overwhelming obsession. When he was 6 or 7 years old, Howard's parents enrolled him at the Prosso School in Houston, an elite private elementary school. Howard, his teachers noted, was an intelligent boy, but only an average student. Like many children not sufficiently motivated to learn, Howard took little interest in most of his studies and tended to neglect those subjects he did not enjoy. Like his father, he showed a fascination for mechanical things, becoming passionately interested in new electronics. He often left his homework incomplete in favor of pursuing any number of small engineering projects. Howard was one of the first, if not the first person in the city of Houston to build his own wireless radio set. Those parts he could not purchase locally or order by mail, he scavenged by taking apart his family's doorbell. Happy and encouraged by his son's interests, which seemed to match his own, Howard Sr. set young Howard up with his own little work table at the Sharp Hughes Tool Company, where he could examine, assemble and disassemble mechanical and electronic bits and pieces to his heart's content. When Howard was 11, he and his father built a motorized bicycle together. Another example of a great novelty in early 1900s Houston, and Howard proudly zipped about his neighborhood on it. In his later teen years, he even attempted to build a steam-powered car. Though he had warm and supportive relationships with his parents and extended family of aunts, uncles, and grandparents, Howard found it continually difficult to build relationships outside his family. He was exceedingly shy and reticent, like his mother, preferring to play and work on his various engineering projects by himself. Though he grew up on the same street as dozens of other children and attended school, church, and summer camp with dozens more, Howard only ever made one friend during his childhood. Dudley Sharp, the son of his father's business partner, was Howard's polar opposite. Where he was quiet, shy, and awkward, Dudley was outgoing, gregarious, and funny. Despite their differences, they got on very well, and each seemed to admire the other for something unique, which he himself did not possess. Howard was impressed by Dudley's confidence and charisma, while Dudley admired Howard's single-minded ability to focus and commit to the completion of a project. At school, there wasn't much that Howard seemed to think was worth doing. Yet, if his interest was piqued, Howard would doggedly see any effort through to the finish. When the two boys began taking saxophone lessons together, Dudley gave up within a few weeks, convinced he would never improve, while Howard kept at it for months after Dudley quit, driving his parents crazy with his daily practice, though he never achieved more than middling success with the instrument. In the fall of 1920, when he was 14, Howard was sent away to boarding school in Boston. His parents enrolled him at the prestigious Fessenden School, a preparatory academy well known for sending students to Ivy League colleges. Howard Sr. was particularly hopeful that his son might go to Harvard as he had, even though Howard Sr. had never finished his own education. For the first time in his academic career, Howard Jr. began to excel at his studies. He did quite well at Fessenden, working hard and achieving good marks in most of his subjects, but particularly in maths and sciences. Despite these changes, Howard proved no more willing to come out of his shell than he had in Houston, and remained quiet, aloof, and awkward with his fellow students. Howard spent only 1 year attending school in Boston, but it was an exceptionally rich and productive time for him for all that it was brief. He had finally gained enough maturity and discipline to master his studies, even those he did not necessarily enjoy. He also discovered two of the great loves of his life while attending Fessenden: golf and aviation. Fessenden's richly endowed campus included a 9-hole golf course, and Howard quickly fell in love with the game. It certainly suited his personality, a game of mastery that requires all one's focus and dogged persistence in order to excel. Moreover, it can also be a fairly quiet game, even a solitary one, something which the socially awkward 14-year-old may have appreciated. Howard became a highly skilled and impressive golfer and would continue to play regularly throughout the next 20 years against both amateur and professional players. For a time, he even nurtured the hope that he might pursue a professional career in the sport himself and become the world's greatest golfer, winning every tournament, national or international. During his year studying at Fessenden, Howard also had his first experience with aerial flight. During a weekend visit to Boston, Howard Sr. had taken his son to see the Harvard-Yale boat races. While they were driving out to New London, Howard spotted a roadside sign advertising short trips in a little seaplane for $5 per passenger. Made jubilant by Harvard's victory in the crew races that day, Howard Sr. asked his son if there were any special treat he might like to cap off their day together. Howard immediately asked if they could take an airplane ride. His first flight lasted no longer than 15 minutes, but Howard found himself transported. The experience endowed him not only with a love of flying, but also a fierce ambition to eventually become a pilot and an innovator in the aviation industry. By the summer of 1921, Howard's parents were spending more and more time in Los Angeles, where Hughes Tool Company had recently established new offices and distribution locations. Rather than send their son all the way back to the East Coast to continue high school, Eileen and Howard Sr. instead enrolled their son at the Thatcher School, a small private academy in Ojai, California, where he could be reasonably close to them. Since Thatcher admitted only about 60 students at a time, they were full by the time the Hughes family applied. Howard Sr. may have secured his son's admission with the offer to build a new auditorium for the school. Howard continued to do decently well academically at Thatcher, but unfortunately, he proved no more willing or adept at making friends, continuing to spend most of his time alone. In a rare instance of social courage, however, he auditioned for and won a part in the school play that year, in which he played a detective. In March of 1922, when Howard was 16 years old, he experienced the first and perhaps the most terrible grief of his life when his mother died quite suddenly. She had been admitted to hospital in Houston for what surviving records refer to vaguely as a curettage procedure, which usually involves removing excess material from the lining of the uterus. It is possible that Eileen Hughes might have had a miscarriage and was receiving aftercare measures. Whatever the cause, Eileen Hughes is believed to have died as a result of the anesthesia rather than the procedure itself. She simply never woke up, dying shortly after surgery at the age of just 38. Both her husband and son were utterly devastated by Eileen's death and reacted to it very similarly. Grief was a dark, terrible thing that had to play out in private. Howard never spoke about his mother's death, even to his father, who was equally broken-hearted following his wife's passing. Howard Sr. left the family home in Houston within days of Eileen's death and never returned, unable to bear the house without her. He traveled instead to Los Angeles, leaving the able managers and administrators at the Texas headquarters of his company to run the business quite independent of day-to-day micromanagement, as he always had. Howard Jr. was as grieved by Eileen's loss as his father, and deeply worried about him. He considered leaving school and joining Howard Sr. in Los Angeles. While both Howard Sr. and the Thatcher School's headmaster saw the value in persuading the boy to finish out the school year, they eventually both agreed that what he needed most was to be with his family. Howard Sr. was secretly relieved and content to have his son move to Los Angeles to be near him, though Howard Jr. never did finish high school. As it turned out, it didn't matter. Howard Sr. was now so rich that a generous donation now served to get him whatever he wanted. During the year following his mother's death, Howard lived with his Aunt Annette, his mother's sister, in Pasadena, while his father stayed in Los Angeles, closer to his business activities, though father and son spent time together every week. Thanks to a hefty donation from his father, the California Institute of Technology permitted Howard to attend classes and receive private tutoring from professors, although he received no credit and was never formally registered there. On Sundays, he usually joined his father for lunch at his Uncle Rupert's house in Los Angeles. Rupert Hughes, Howard Sr.'s brother, was a highly paid and sought-after screenwriter in the Hollywood community during the silent film era, and his lavish and well-attended parties introduced both Howard Sr. and Howard Jr. to a glittering world of film stars and movie magic that both father and son alike found attractive and exciting. In the autumn, Howard was sent back home to Houston to attend Rice University. Biographers have assumed that he was admitted with yet another hefty donation from his father since he lacked a high school diploma. Howard's Aunt Annette returned with him, and the two moved back into the family home, where Howard Sr. hoped that his son might find some stability once again, though he himself could still not bear to return. In fact, he returned to Houston itself only once during the 2 years following his wife's death. In January of 1924, Howard Hughes Sr. came back to the city that haunted him to attend a business meeting at his company headquarters. He suffered a massive heart attack during the course of the meeting and died soon after losing consciousness. He was 54 years old. The loss of his father coming so soon upon the heels of his mother's death stunned Howard. He had turned 18 just a few weeks before, and now he was on his own. Howard underwent noticeable personality changes following the deaths of his parents. He became harder, much more independent and fiercely self-possessed, an individualist with a notably rebellious and contrary spirit toward anyone who doubted his ability to achieve whatever he wanted. He had inherited his mother's phobia of germs and contamination and the sudden and traumatic deaths of his parents, and given him a sense of disquieting fatalism that he might also be destined for an early grave. The change in Howard, his family members recalled, was quite dramatic. Formerly a preternaturally polite, well-behaved, timid, and biddable boy, he now outrightly refused to be told what to do. Biographers have speculated that it was the awe in which he held his parents that had been responsible for his exemplary childhood behavior. Howard Sr. had been a strong and forceful personality, for all that he had been a good father. Howard Jr. had idolized him, and had likewise revered his mother Aline as the epitome of loving gentleness. Their deaths laid bare a very different incarnation of their only son, one who would remain mysterious and unpredictable to almost everyone, even those select few who managed to develop any kind of relationship with him. Within a month of his father's passing, Howard dropped out of Rice University against the advice of his aunts and uncles. He had gone to college willingly, it seemed, to please his father. But now, Howard was determined to be his own man, and school did not interest him. He reacted badly to concerns within his father's family that he was too young to take control of his father's company and fortune. He particularly clashed with his uncle Rupert, who advised him to go back to school and to accept Rupert as his guardian and executor until he came of age at 21. Howard seemed to interpret this as an attempt to take control of his fortune, and he soon broke permanently with his father's side of the family. Rather than accept a guardian, he instead petitioned the court to be declared an adult by way of emancipation, which a person as young as 18 might do if both of their parents had died or were otherwise irrevocably estranged from their child. During the summer of 1924, Howard began courting Ella Rice, the daughter of a prominent Houston family and whose great-uncle had established Rice University. Ella was 2 years older than Howard and rather like Aline Hughes to look at, with dark hair and eyes, but was far more outgoing and charming, one of the most popular and sought-after debutantes in Houston. Howard was still quite shy and withdrawn, but he believed himself to be in love and was determined to win Ella's hand. He himself had grown into a handsome young man, trim and exceptionally tall at 6'4", with black hair and dark brown eyes. He and Ella had known one another since they were children, as both had attended Christ Church Cathedral in Houston every Sunday with their families. In the spring of 1925, Howard asked Ella to marry him, and she accepted. The two were married on the 1st of June in the Rose Garden at the home of the bride's sister. Howard's childhood friend, Dudley Sharp, stood as his best man. That autumn, Howard and Ella left Houston for Los Angeles, where Howard was determined to get involved in producing motion pictures. Between 1926 and 1932, Howard Hughes financed and produced 6 films, 2 of which he directed. The first, Swell Hogan, was reportedly so terrible that all agreed it should not see the light of day. His second film, Two Arabian Nights, which premiered in 1927, won an Academy Award for Best Director. Howard made his directorial debut in one of Hollywood's first talkies, the First World War aviation epic, Hell's Angels. This film launched 17-year-old Jean Harlow's career as Hollywood's original blonde bombshell sex symbol. In the context of the pre-code motion picture industry, Hell's Angels featured quite a lot of risky language and sexually suggestive content, which soon had some members of the public calling for censorship standards in American film. The script, critics reflected, was weak, but the aviation scenes which Hughes had taken such time and pains to shoot, and at such exorbitant cost, were universally pronounced spectacular and groundbreaking. Few knew at the time what it had truly cost to produce the film. One of the pilots hired to shoot some of the dogfighting scenes died during a planned crash, along with a mechanic who, for reasons which remain unknown, failed to bail out of the plane in time. Howard himself suffered serious injuries and spent some weeks in hospital following his own plane crash on the set of the film. Watching the stunt pilots perform their impressive maneuvers, and having had a good bit of flight instruction and experience himself, Howard could not resist hopping into one of the dozen or so planes he had purchased for the film and taking off for a quick flight of his own. When he tried to bank shortly after takeoff, his plane suddenly descended into a downward spin just 400 feet off the ground, and the film crew could only watch, horrified and helpless, as Hughes' plane crashed to the ground. The newspapers reported that Howard had walked out of the wreck virtually unharmed, quote, combing pieces of motor and glass from his hair. This kind of press around Howard Hughes was typical, and he was to actively encourage such disingenuous curation of his public image or his life. In fact, Howard had been pulled unconscious from the smoking wreck with one cheekbone crushed, requiring facial reconstructive surgery and weeks of recovery. His face looked noticeably different following the accident, and it increased his sense of mortality and fragility around bodily health, but utterly failed to dampen his desire to keep flying. The rest of the films which Howard produced during this early part of his film career did quite well, though he didn't do much better than break even with the investments he had made. The Front Page, released in 1931, was nominated at the 4th Academy Awards for Best Director, Best Film, and Best Actor. The 1932 film Scarface received no nominations, but much acclaim as well as controversy, and is today considered a landmark film. Scarface, adapted from a novel loosely based on the life of Al Capone, ventured into the realm of the American ganglands, and with a realism that viewers found shocking. It was probably the most explicitly violent feature film ever produced up until that time, once again pitting Howard Hughes against forces demanding censorship. Howard seemed to be drawn to filmmaking that catered to sensationalism, action, sex, and violence, and in order to ensure that his considerable investments in these productions would pay off, he was forced to become an anti-censorship advocate. Howard was no particular defender of free speech or expression, but, as time would tell, he was frequently an active opponent of any legal or political entity that sought to prevent him from doing what he wanted. He would certainly change his tune about censorship and freedom of expression later on, when he fired hundreds of staff from his newly acquired RKO studios for any expressed or even suspected communist sympathies. Howard established a pattern during his early career in Hollywood that was to characterize him for the rest of his professional life, that of the single-minded and tireless workaholic. Almost as soon as he and Ella arrived in California, Howard diverted all of his attention to the movie business quite literally to the exclusion of all else. He had established Ella in a lovely house in Pasadena, where she soon made friends among the local social set, but Howard refused to allow her to mix with his Hollywood friends and colleagues in the Los Angeles area, where he spent the bulk of his time. Howard's family members believed that he did not want his wife mixing with the more unconventional or reputedly scandalous Hollywood types. Unfortunately, Howard's obsessive and all-consuming work habits kept him away from home sometimes for days at a time. Ella spent more and more time alone and grew more and more unhappy. Finally admitting that Howard wasn't going to change or let her in, she quietly left Pasadena for her hometown of Houston in the fall of 1928 for a trial separation. She divorced him the following year. Howard did not contest the divorce. This kind of behavior became typical of Howard in many of his romantic relationships throughout his life. Once settled, he would throw himself back into his professional obsessions. Many of the women he formed relationships with found themselves ignored and sidelined once Howard felt his conquest had been made. Yet, some of these women recalled that regardless of his neglect, he reacted with feelings of jealousy and rejection when they tried to end their relationships with him and move on. Howard had a habit of establishing 24-hour surveillance on the women he believed were his in order to restore any waning control he might still hold over them. Yet, even with a willing romantic partner, Howard continually failed to truly open up. Between the 1920s and the 1950s, Howard held the reputation of a billionaire playboy and was romantically linked to a veritable parade of beautiful and famous women whose names read like a who's who of Photoplay magazine. Billy Dove, Joan Crawford, Ava Gardner, Carol Lombard, Katharine Hepburn, Hedy Lamarr, Rita Hayworth, Betty Davis, Yvonne De Carlo, Olivia de Havilland, Ginger Rogers, and Jean Tierney, just to name a few. All dated Howard Hughes at one time or another prior to his second marriage in 1957. Though most of Howard's relationships were of rather short duration, these women were some of the very few people besides Hughes' assistants and colleagues who could speak to what kind of person Howard was in his day-to-day life, and subsequent interviews with many of these individuals have shed light on the evolution of Howard's character and state of mind over time. Howard's preoccupation with health and cleanliness continued to grow. As he grew older, he became more concerned about germs and contamination. He took to using tissues to pick up any object, was deeply bothered by spots and stains on people's clothing or their lack of neatness, and actively avoided large parties and gatherings, preferring to attend smaller social events in people's homes. Even among smaller groups, however, Howard still struggled to interact socially with others. Hollywood contemporaries recalled that Howard might talk to no more than one or two people in the course of any party, spending most of it sitting by himself somewhere, looking at his hands or at the floor, anywhere really, except at another person. He seemed to crave fame and adulation, and yet was loath to allow most people near him, and when in mixed social company, had little to say. Only work seemed to bring him out of his shell and put him back in control of himself. Modern medical commentators speculate that Howard's preoccupations, anxieties, and utterly single-minded dedication to his work and ambitions signal that he struggled with one or more mental health conditions. Most believe that he suffered from severe obsessive-compulsive disorder. During the 1930s, perhaps owing to his ever-expanding collection of airplanes that began during the making of Hell's Angels, Howard Hughes began to pursue the aviation field much more actively. In fact, he did not go back to producing films until the following decade, and while the rest of America was struggling through the Depression, Howard poured himself into the pursuit of aerospace innovation. He established the Hughes Aircraft Company, purchased land for the construction of airfields, rented out whole sections of airport hangars for workspace, and hired the most brilliant engineers, the most skilled mechanics, and the most experienced pilots to help produce what he hoped would be the world's fastest plane. By 1934, Howard and his team had produced the H-1 Racer. Though they were not the original innovators of any one of the plane's remarkable features, no plane had ever featured all of them in the same design, including the short, curved, high-speed wings, drag-resistant structure, and retractable landing gear. Piloting the H-1 Racer himself, Howard Hughes set several impressive airspeed records, winning many accolades throughout the decade, including the 1936 and 1938 Harmon Trophies, the 1938 Collier Trophy for Excellence in Aviation, and a Congressional Gold Medal in 1939. Just as Lucky Lindy, or Charles Lindbergh, was one of the most popular and admired public figures of the 1920s for his successful solo flight across the Atlantic, Hughes became incredibly famous for pioneering this still relatively new technology. In 1938, he set a new record of just 91 hours for a flight around the world, beating the previously held record in less than half the time. The city of New York commemorated Hughes' achievement with a grand ticker tape parade upon his return to the States. Howard did not get back to making movies until the early 1940s. That he did not abandon his aviation pursuits. Far from it. In fact, Howard's business interests began to become more and more entangled with one another during this period, a habit which would lead to more than one accusation of antitrust. Via the rich purchasing power of the Hughes Aircraft Company, which was, in fact, funded by the still lucrative Hughes Tool, Howard began to quietly acquire stock in RKO Pictures in the early 1940s, and by 1948, he became the majority shareholder in the film company, whose value comprised the studio itself and its productions, but also a nationwide chain of movie theaters. Howard himself produced 9 films for RKO over a 14-year period, including the 1943 film The Outlaw, which he personally directed and which starred actress Jane Russell in her breakout film role. At the same time, Howard was beginning to build Hughes Aircraft into a major defense contractor. With the increasing possibility of the United States becoming engaged in World War II, Hughes used his reputation and achievements to secure government contracts worth tens of millions to produce aircraft and various other technologies for the US military. None of the planes designed or built as prototypes by Hughes Aircraft were ready before the end of the war. Neither did any of the government orders see completion. In May of 1943, an S-43 Sikorsky crashed during a flight certification test with Hughes himself at the controls, killing one of the inspectors as well as a Hughes aircraft employee. Howard also crashed the XF-11 during its test flight and was nearly killed. He had reportedly gone beyond the maximum 45 minutes of flight time when the plane began to fail. He attempted an emergency landing at a Los Angeles golf course, but instead crashed into a residential Beverly Hills neighborhood, setting fire to 3 homes and suffering critical injuries. Howard spent several months in hospital recovering from a broken collarbone, several cracked ribs, and terrible burns on his hands and chest. Perhaps the most egregious example of wasted money, both Howard's and the US government's, was the H-4 Hercules aircraft, known more popularly as the Spruce Goose. It remained the largest aircraft ever built until 2019, a flying boat with a body of laminated birch, not spruce, intended to transport enormous amounts of troops and supplies across the Atlantic. Designed to carry numerous tanks, as well as other airplanes, the H-4 was 5 stories tall and had a wingspan the length of an American football field. It flew only once, in November of 1947, with Hughes piloting successfully through the test flight. He had been determined to prove it could be built and that it would fly, and continued to pour his own money into the project for 3 more years after the military cancelled the contract. Howard also began to acquire stock in Trans World Airlines, known more familiarly as TWA, in 1939, eventually gaining a 78% controlling interest by 1944. He did not, however, build the planes used by the airline himself, buying them instead from Lockheed and Boeing. Hughes may have been an impressive pilot and a generally capable engineer, but he was not experienced or knowledgeable enough as an aviation designer, which his career as a defense contractor demonstrated. Throughout his career building airplanes, he showed a distinct habit of micromanaging and antagonizing lead designers and engineers who considered him simply too difficult to work with. Howard tended to react badly to things he didn't want to hear, but which were nonetheless true. He was also reputed to get bogged down and paralyzed by details, missing the big picture completely. The most unsung achievements of the Hughes Aircraft Company during the early stage of aviation were actually the most successful. Howard may have failed to produce a more useful plane than the H-1 Racer, but Hughes Aircraft actually produced a great many new technologies as a military contractor during the 1940s, including the earliest reconnaissance and communications satellites, the first working laser, and advanced navigation and in-flight computer systems. In the mid-1940s, about a year after his second plane crash and amid a storm of government protest over his military contracts, Howard Hughes suffered his first nervous breakdown. Howard quite literally worked all the time. He no longer communicated with his family and had no real friends besides his professional colleagues. In the fall of 1944, he temporarily and quietly delegated all of his authority to his administrative assistant, Nadine Henley, and then, essentially, dropped off the face of the earth for several months. Years later, a former mechanic of Hughes aircraft reported that he and Howard had spent the time on an extended vacation under assumed names, traveling back and forth between hotels in Las Vegas and Reno, Nevada, and Palm Springs, California. It would not be the last time that Howard, one of the most famous men in America, would completely disappear from public view. Each time, he managed to erect a barrier of money and privacy between himself and the outside world so impenetrable that significant doubts still persist about whether biographers can accurately say for certain where Hughes was or what he was doing at any given time, especially during his later years when his mental and physical state is believed to have degenerated dramatically and he remained unseen for nearly a decade. During the 1950s and 1960s, Hughes faced accusations of creating a business monopoly and attempted indictments for antitrust. He was forced to sell RKO Pictures and TWA, nonetheless making hundreds of millions from these transactions. The antitrust accusations may have been the reason why Hughes sought to establish the Hughes Medical Institute by 1953. Howard first mentioned the institute in a will he made when he was 19, just before his first marriage. It was his wish that it be established in Houston to investigate infectious diseases, and that it should, like his father's company Hughes Tool, long outlast him and continue to operate on the endowment of the Hughes fortune. Howard's initial intentions were most likely pure, and indeed, his overall purpose for the Institute might have always remained equally honest. But the Hughes Medical Institute actually provided tax cover for Howard in various ways. For example, the Institute purchased Hughes Aircraft Company in 1954, putting a major manufacturer in the hands of a tax-exempt charity and arranging a system of leasing and subleasing that ultimately attracted an investigation by the IRS against the country's richest man. It was one that, predictably, did not succeed. Howard became more and more reclusive and mysterious throughout the late 1950s and 1960s. While commentators at worst might refer to him as eccentric, in reality, Hughes' OCD symptoms were becoming more pronounced every year. He ate the exact same meal for dinner every day and issued an exhaustive list of non-negotiable protocols for preparing his meals safely and hygienically. He also began to spend longer and longer periods of time in almost total isolation, running his business empire over the phone or in handwritten memos that he would hand off to his aides to deliver to other employees. Barricaded in a suite in one hotel or another, and seen only by his closest aides, Howard would go naked and frequently unwashed and ungroomed for days, weeks, and even months, endlessly watching television or movies. Just as he insisted on using tissue to pick up any object, paper towels likewise covered his chairs and bed. Though his increasing fragility owed much to his mental health challenges, Howard's mental state might have been worsened by the increasing number of antitrust lawsuits and congressional subpoenas he continued to face. They might also have partly motivated his desire to isolate himself totally, to avoid having to testify or even appear publicly. The suspicion that one of his longtime executives, Noah Dietrich, intended to attempt to have Howard declared legally incompetent may also have contributed to Howard's second major nervous breakdown. In 1957, Hughes married his longtime girlfriend, actress Jean Peters, in a private ceremony in Tonopah, Nevada. Unfortunately, this marriage proved no closer or more successful than his marriage to Ella, for Howard refused to live in the same house with Jean, even from the very first. They returned to Los Angeles together after the wedding and often traveled together in the ensuing years, but they always stayed in separate suites and often in separate hotels. Peters finally initiated divorce proceedings against Hughes in 1970, claiming she had not actually seen him since 1966. Their divorce was finalized in 1971. In fact, by 1966, Howard Hughes had not been seen in years by anyone except 2 or 3 personal aides who took care of his daily needs, carried his handwritten memos for delivery to his business associates, and kept everyone else at bay. Though he had gone into almost complete seclusion, his determination to continue to do business remained as strong as ever. In November of that year, Howard quietly arrived in Las Vegas by train from Boston. He promptly checked into the Desert Inn, taking over the entire top floor of the hotel. After 4 months of residency, the owners of the hotel began pressuring Hughes to vacate the penthouse. Instead, he purchased the entire resort. It was the beginning of another single-minded obsession: to remake Las Vegas and to own as much of it as possible. Howard believed that Vegas should be a city of luxurious sophistication and class, not a family resort with a cheap carnival-like atmosphere as it appeared to him. Over the next 4 years, he acquired multiple casinos and hotels. He also managed to bribe almost every county and state official all the way up to the governor with campaign contributions and regular payoffs in order to maintain influence over state and local policy, legislation, and law enforcement. He purchased KLAS, a local television station for which he personally instructed the staff with regard to programming. Eventually, these activities would land him in another antitrust lawsuit, which arrived just on the heels of the judgment in his TWA lawsuit, which cost Hughes nearly $150 million. Just a few months later, Howard acquired a controlling interest in Air West Airlines, for which a U.S. attorney would later indict him for conspiring to drive down the stock price before the buyout. Howard would have to keep moving in order to avoid further subpoenas. Hughes is believed to have spent the last 6 years of his life abroad, continuing to conduct business secluded and closely guarded in various luxurious foreign hotels. He fled first to Nassau, Bahamas, and then later Vancouver, Canada, and Managua, Nicaragua. He was supposedly desperately ill throughout this period, reportedly weighing no more than 100 pounds and covered in bed sores. Some reports state that the plane crashes in which he'd been involved had led to a nerve disorder which caused him constant pain. His hygiene was reportedly abominable, with hair and nails which were trimmed only once a year, if that. Howard was said to have managed this terrible existence with huge amounts of codeine, which he received by intravenous injection and to which he had become hopelessly addicted. According to public record, Howard Hughes died on board a private plane traveling from Acapulco, Mexico, to Houston, Texas, on the 5th of April 1976, the victim of an unintended overdose of painkillers which made his kidneys shut down. His body and identity were confirmed using his fingerprints, and he was laid to rest in Houston next to his parents, Howard Sr. and Arlene Hughes. This official story remained unchallenged until 2015, when a new biography was published, claiming that Hughes had faked his own death, adopted a new identity, married again, and lived out the rest of his life in Troy, Alabama, dying in November of 2001 at the age of 95. According to this account, Hughes had a body double since 1958, and the Howard, whom everybody identified as the sick and dying recluse, was not Hughes at all, but the unfortunate Ringer, whose condition had degenerated horribly after someone, thinking the double was indeed Howard, had attempted to murder him by shooting him in the back of the head. This, the biographer claims, explains why some witnesses claimed to have seen Howard personally during the last few years of his life, looking, quote, healthy, well-groomed and sharp, while those who caught brief glimpses of the reclusive Howard would swear that the poor, confused, and terribly sick creature could not possibly be the same man. While these claims are difficult, if not impossible, to fully substantiate, it is not entirely beyond the realm of possibility that Howard might have sought to fake his own death in order to escape indictment. He had a long history not only with cloak and dagger business practices, but also a long and close acquaintanceship with the CIA. Two former storefront CIA operatives, Robert Mayhew and Robert F. Bennett, had worked for Hughes as his right-hand men at different times. Howard also provided cover in 1971 for the secret CIA operation to raise and confiscate the sunken Soviet submarine K-129 from the bottom of the Pacific, including the two nuclear weapons on board. Hughes allowed the press to believe that the Glomar salvage vessel was his own and that its mission was deep-sea mining. Most cloak and dagger of all, Howard was even indirectly implicated in the Watergate break-in at Democratic National Committee headquarters on June 17, 1974. Former CIA operatives working for presidential candidate Richard Nixon were instructed to steal documents that would inform the Nixon campaign about what the Democratic campaign might or might not know about Nixon's illegal activities. 2 years previously, Hughes had made a secret $100,000 donation to Nixon via his aide Bebe Rebozo, perhaps to forestall an indictment, perhaps simply to create a future quid pro quo of some sort. A Democratic operative had planted the suspicion in the Nixon camp that the Democrats had evidence of Nixon's corrupt dealings with Hughes, but could not say what it was. In fact, the Democrats had nothing, but Nixon's camp didn't know that. Less than 2 weeks before the Watergate break-in, Hughes' private warehouse of offices, vaults, and storage facilities was burgled, and more than 10,000 confidential documents stolen. Documents which were never recovered by law enforcement. Panicked and desperate to know what the other camp knew or didn't know, Nixon ordered the break-in. Rest is history. Biographical accounts and oral histories diverge from one another so sharply that we may never know the real Howard Hughes. Despite the fact that he was one of the wealthiest, most powerful, and most famous men of the 20th century, he continues to elude us. When he was 19, Howard's goals were fourfold: become the world's greatest golfer, a successful movie producer, the world's greatest aviator, and finally, the world's richest man. The fact that he conclusively achieved 3 out of these 4 goals is utterly remarkable. Few have the determination to realize so much in one lifetime, but then again, even fewer have the raw economic and social power to remake their own lives as well as the world around them, the way that Hughes did. Howard Hughes was a giant of the old robber baron tradition of men like John D. Rockefeller and William Randolph Hearst, men whose power proved so overwhelming that the laws and conventions of democratic states, supposedly subject to the rule of law, bent instead to their will and their wealth. The problems inherent in maintaining order and justice in democratic societies, which are also subject to the will of the very richest, are serious issues which we continue to grapple with today. In a new, gilded age of overmighty billionaires. What do you think of Howard Hughes? What was his ultimate impact on our society, culture, and economy? And who was he really? Please, let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime,